You know, our social cohesion in Australia has been under extreme pressure. For a country that's always prided itself as being welcoming and tolerant, we're now seeing foreign animosities play out in our streets, from Western Sydney to the Melbourne Town Hall, in suburban synagogues, churches and mosques, and at the steps of our iconic Opera House, of course. Those I've interviewed from Europe warn us not to let what's happened there happen here. And by that they mean the erosion of Western civilization's values. Joining me now to discuss how and if we can change course, Sky News contributor Chris Uhlmann. Well, Chris, welcome. I've always thought we were a bit removed from what's going on in Europe, but that's not really the case anymore, is it?
Well, Peter, it was always going to be a long-run question for a multicultural society, and that is, how do we find a sense of common purpose, particularly when we're constantly told to celebrate the things that divide us. And so now we're seeing old world hatreds leech into the new world. I do think that there has to be a piece around citizenship and around unity that we're not hearing at the moment, which is when you do sign up to be an Australian citizen or a permanent resident of this country, you owe your first allegiance to this country, and you should try as best you can to leave your old hatreds behind you. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't have passionate disagreements, but when we see the kind of violence essentially that's escalating in and around our society at the moment, it has to be a real concern about how we find a sense of unity. I would caution this, though. Australia is no stranger to sectarianism. I grew up a Catholic, Irish Catholic background, and Protestants and Catholics were deeply divided in Australia, particularly during the First World War over the argument about conscription. So we can find a common cause, but I don't hear the public debate about what it is that we are going to build an Australia with a common purpose around.
Well, regardless of your religion or even the case of no religion, our institutions are built on Judeo-Christian values, right? That's a statement of fact. A rule of law in particular, our parliamentary institutions, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. There's a warning today from the President of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, concerned about proposed changes to the census, which will lower the number of people identifying as religious. That's the argument. Now, I've had a bit of involvement in the past in the census process. Governments are heavily involved here. This is not a bureaucratic mistake that they're putting questions in there that are trying to shape a different view, particularly of religion. Is this a concern?
Yeah, look, I can't look into their hearts or know their minds or know what motivates it. I do know that particularly the Catholic Church is feeling under siege at the moment and would see this as being of a piece with a kind of assault on religion across the board. And the fascinating thing about Australia today, Peter, is that there is a religious war going on, and only one side recognises that it's talking theology, because the idea of human rights that we have in Australia, which people see as a secular idea, actually comes from Christianity. It was when it was decided that you could have a personal relationship with God that people started to talk about individual human rights. So the child no longer recognises the parent anymore and is actively hostile towards it. Now religious institutions face the possibility that they won't be able to hire people that agree with their worldview inside their schools and their hospitals. And I think that's a huge concern. So make no mistake, this is a theological war at the moment. And one side is a state-based religion, which is trying to make sure that the old faiths are pulled into line.
I've been pretty critical about the failure of authorities to call out Islamist terrorism. That's nothing against Islam per se. It's not about Muslim people. It's about Islamist terrorism. Now, Greg Sheridan today has picked up that theme in his column. The politicians, the police are all dancing around it. Surely we can't defeat what it is unless we name it.
Oh, I would agree wholeheartedly. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck, right? So I don't know for sure because I've only seen reports of it, but if one of those young boys had a picture of Osama bin Laden on his phone, then he's got the wrong kind of heroes, and that is Sunni violent extremism that we are talking about there. Mike Burgess did call that out, by the way, at his annual threat assessment as being the greatest counter-terrorism threat to Australia. I do understand the argument that some are making about using the term religious extremism. That would go back to the fact that we saw an of Christian extremism last year when those police were shot in Queensland. So I can understand the debate, but I think the clearest way to speak is if it's Christian extremism, call it Christian extremism. If it's Islamist extremism, call it Islamist extremism.
Talk to me about China. You wrote a crack of a piece in the Australian over the weekend about just how susceptible we are from a cyber attack out of Beijing. We talk about, Defence Force preparedness, but we are vulnerable when it comes to our cyber networks, aren't we?
Yeah, there's a conflict already underway inside our borders, and that worries me to some extent more than how we're going to deal with the one external to our borders, because I don't think Australia faces an imminent threat of an invasion. But what's happening is China is pre-positioning virtual bombs inside our critical infrastructure. How on earth is that the action of a friendly nation? It is preparing for a war, and the first we might know of it is when the lights go out and the dams burst. This is what modern warfare is about. I saw some of this in Ukraine last year. So there's two fronts that really bother me, Peter, where I don't think that we are really being well served. One is the information war, which rages every single day from hostile countries, and the other is the cyber war, which is underway. So I do hope that the federal government is looking at that. I know they've got a program called Red Bridge. I'm hoping that we are planting a few bombs in their networks. And surely, though, if we are going to cooperate where we can and disagree where we must, when the Chinese Premier comes to Australia, what are your first points on the agenda be, Peter? I've got a fairly solid point of disagreement with you, and that's stop planting bombs on our critical infrastructure.
Well, we'll see what happens when he does arrive. Chris Uhlmann, thank you. Great to have you on the show as always.